I'm Leanne Tran, psychologist who's worked with families whose kids don't fit the mould for almost 20 years. I've worked with children for decades, but I know parents are the real change makers when it comes to their kids. Having 3 kids of my own means I know it's not easy. Parent Like a Psychologist is all about simplifying how you support your kids with psychology information filtered through years of experience to take you from overwhelmed to confident. Come on in. Hey again, thanks so much for tuning in for another episode. Today I'm talking about sensory-friendly activities, things to do over the holidays that can cater to a range of different sensory processing preferences. It's probably the best way to put it. I think all parents of kids with sensory processing differences know how much of a factor it plays in life and in different activities and making it, in determining whether it's going to be successful or not. So I know I don't need to convince you about why it's important to think about your child's sensory needs. I did want to say first off though that it's important to be thinking about the triggers for sensory overwhelm. Everybody's at a different stage in their journey with this stuff, I know. All parents, as you learn about it, it's really can be eye-opening, and then as you get more experience in managing it well, it becomes less daunting and easier to predict and manage these things. So if you do have any tips, please do share them on Instagram, maybe on the my page, or send it to me, because I'm sure other parents will benefit from that as well. So identifying the triggers, I think, is important to think about the types of events that your kids are used to doing, but then more importantly, when you're doing activities they're not used to doing, and think about the types of things that might be difficult for them to handle. So last podcast episode, I talked about an example of Christmas carols in the park. This is one I think parents, I seem to be talking about it a lot this time of year. And I think it's one of those, sometimes those tradition things that we only do them once a year. So they're not as familiar to our kids. They're not as predictable, and they can be overwhelming. So when you're thinking about the triggers for your child, think about their sensitivities, I guess, is one thing. If they're sensitive to things like sound and lights and people, lots of people, or movement, like big crowds, that's something to really keep in mind. The other thing I wanted to talk about is not so much when kids are triggered by different feelings, but sensory processing, but maybe when they seek a lot of certain things and they need a lot of certain things. So if your child's one that needs a lot of movement, that's going to be difficult to handle in situations where you might have to sit still for a long time. So sometimes it's not being overwhelmed by the senses, it's not being able to engage in those activities. So if your child is one who finds it really hard to sit down for dinner, they're going to find it really hard to sit through long events like, if it's Christmas services or things like that. So keeping that in mind is helpful. You can then do some things to minimize those challenges, and I'll get to that in a minute. But because first I wanted to say, it doesn't have to be that hard. If your kids don't like those things, you don't have to do them. You can choose activities that don't involve such sensory information. And so it might be that you, rather than doing things like spend time in the shopping centre in the Christmas rush, you might be spending time outdoors where kids can run wild and free. And outdoors there's often less noise, there's less artificial light and that kind of thing. So you can just choose to do things that fit your kids' sensory preferences and say no to some other stuff. But if you are going to, what was I going to say? Oh yeah, sorry, I mixed up my order and then now I've gotten out of track. But what I wanted to say is that you can adapt some of the activities. So if there are things that you want to do because it's important to you as a parent or other people in your family, you can adapt those things by trying to cater for the sensory needs. So that might be, the obvious one is using headphones at loud events to minimize the noise. It could be sunglasses to minimize the light and visual overwhelm if that's something that's challenging. It can also be allowing some use of, some sensory input that might be hard not to have. So for kids who can't sit still easily, it might be something to fidget with or fiddle with their hands or their feet while they're in those situations. The other thing is that you could incorporate breaks as well. And so that's a really great way for managing when kids are overwhelmed. They can take a break and a breather, but also if kids are having trouble with sitting still and that kind of thing as well, they can have a movement break so that they can get some of that input that they need and then come back to doing the activity. I think too, if it's about overwhelm, an idea of creating some safe spaces at home is really helpful. It could be that there's just a lot of noise and people and extra activity and bustling at home. And so letting your child know that they have a space they can go to and that you're happy for them to do that is a great idea. So it could be their room. If they're little, it could be somewhere in an open joint space, but that's just quiet for them. And you can communicate that to other people as well. Family visiting, that if your child's gone to that space, they're just a bit overwhelmed and they need a break. And so you want those other people to just leave them to it and that your child will come back when they're ready. This is your time to be a bit of an advocate for your child and what they need. The next thing I like an idea of is that not all kids have sensitivities and some kids really seek sensory information. And so the holidays is a great opportunity to be able to provide lots of those opportunities because if the kids are getting the sensory input that they need, that's going to be really regulating and calming for them. So that might be kids who like water and swimming. They can do heaps of that over the break. There's lots of other opportunities to explore different sensory preferences too. And so if you're thinking tactile, if your kids like to touch things, they can do lots of craft and making activities, or there's museums and science centres they can go to where they get to touch everything. Sometimes places like botanical gardens have sensory trails as well that you can go for a walk through the garden and see and touch and smell different things. Another thing might be auditory processing. So if kids really enjoy music, they can, there's lots of experiences they can do over the summer, whether it's playing instruments or going to concerts or listening to music and making their own instruments at home and maybe outside for a parent's mental well-being. But yeah, engaging in lots of those things while they have the time and the chance to do so can be good. You can also just make that part of the day, and so it's got some kind of regulation component, but it's not all day. Kids might just like to do that in the mornings or in the afternoon when they need a little bit of a refresh or recharge. And then the other thing too is to involve your child in all of this stuff as well. So that means if you're going to activities where you aren't sure they'll manage the sensory components well, talk to them about it and ask what will help them, and offer those solutions. It's not just about having the plan, but by having this conversation with your child as well, they also know that you understand it's going to be hard for them and that you're on board with them using strategies they need to help themselves regulate. So it's more than just a plan. It's a plan, but also the reassurance that you are on their side. I think also I mentioned before, or maybe previous episode, but I think planning is much better than trying to problem solve in the moment. And so making these things known with your child and planning for it is much better than getting there and finding your child overwhelmed and then you are, and you can't find any solution in the problem, so you just need to leave. Sometimes you might get to that point and that's okay. Just leave. It's not a big deal. But if it's something that's important to you or your family, preparing for it's more likely to make it successful. I think too that kind of recognizing children and celebrating them for the effort they've put in or the way they've really tried to handle themselves is important. I think that often we expect kids to do things or help them do it, and we forget to celebrate at the end when they've done it well. And it doesn't have to be a big fanfare, and most often in my house it's not. It's just a matter of saying, I know that was hard for you and I'm really proud of the way you handled it. That's it, as simple as that. You know your child and what they're working on, and it's not so much about meeting anyone else's expectations. For me, it's about knowing when they're working hard on something and that they've done a good job at it, rewarding that or praising that means that you're developing that skill in them, which is that working hard at things skill. And that's one that is beneficial in so many different areas. So that's one I always like to praise when kids are having a hard time. For me in my house this week, it was there's a lot of overwhelm at this end of year time, and so it was me saying when one of the kids was incredibly upset about something, I can see that was really upsetting for you. I'm really proud about the way you got through it, and I hope you feel a bit better. I'm trying to say it without saying too much because of privacy, but you can be descriptive in the praise as well and say exactly what your kids did well that you noticed. And I think it just, is nice for them to hear that, but also means that they're more likely to use that skill next time as well. So here's to having a lot of family fun over the holidays, whether it's full of sensory experiences or not at all, whatever's right for you. And I hope your kids have a great holiday. Thanks for listening to this episode of Parent Like a Psychologist. If you found it helpful, please share on Instagram so other parents can benefit too, and tag me at Leanne Psychology so that I can say a big thank you. Head over to leannetran.com.au to join the village for bite-sized psychology tips straight to your inbox. I really hope this podcast has brought a new perspective and you a step closer towards a calm parent and a thriving child. Have a delightful day.